In this lesson, we're going to work with panes, one of the most important user interface elements in the Houdini environment. If we take a simple object like a box, let's just place that here in our scene, we can look at how it can be viewed using different panes. By default, Houdini opens with 3 panes available. This pane here, the big one, is actually the scene view, and it allows you to manipulate and work with your objects in 3D space. We also have the parameter pane over here. This includes properties that can be set to affect how your objects look and how they are positioned. And we also have the network pane, which gives you access to the nodes that are used to build up objects within the Houdini environment. Now, these pane areas are divided using these little dividers here, which you can actually move back and forth if you want to resize them. This allows you the flexibility of setting up your scene any way that you want. We also have these tabs here, which represent what are called pane tabs. So for instance, you can have a channel editor and a scene view layered on top of each other. Or over here we have this take list and we have the parameter pane. You can take this little plus sign here and make a new pane tab. In this case here we get a new parameter pane because it was just a copy of the other one, which we could then pin down to sort of focus on that box object. If we were to bring a sphere, let's bring a sphere into the scene, you'll see how the first parameter pane, the one that is unlocked, changes back and forth as you move between objects, whereas this locked one stays focused on that one object. And the name of the object in the parameter pane situation, that name actually gets promoted up into the tab there. Whereas with the network view, you actually get the path promoted up into there. Now, network panes, if you don't like the order of them, you can actually drag one over to the arrow here. You can also drag them between panes. So for instance, you could drag this over into this pane if you wanted, although it probably makes more sense over here. So you've got a number of different options in terms of working with pane tabs and layering your different views. This gives you a lot of efficiency because you can have fewer pane sort of zones or areas here, and yet at the same time have many different pane types open. Now, the contents of your different panes can be controlled in a couple different ways. What I'd first like to do, though, is take this pane zone and say, well, let's say we wanted to have another zone. So rather than have them layered with tabs, we want another zone. We can actually use this menu over to the side here. It gives us a number of options, including tearing off the existing pane, working with a floating pane, closing it, maximizing it. We can also split it. So we're going to split left and right. Now, once we have that, we're going to take this pane and we're going to right-click on there to create a tree view. Now, we do have a tree view hidden under here, but we'd like to have one up in the front face here. Now, once we have that, we may want to move it over to there. So the way we do that is with this little area right here. You'll see it's a flipping icon. You flip that over there, and then you can actually set up everything from this pane moved over here, and all the pane tabs from here moved over to here. So you've got some organizational abilities there. You've also got these little arrows here, which are quite nice. Let's go over to here. Let's say that these 2 panes, you don't need them all the time. You can click the little arrow here. That removes them, lets you work a little bit more with a bigger workspace here. If you need them back, you just click there, bring that up. Of course, you can do the same thing if you need a bigger network view. You can increase that, go up there, and collapse that, or open that back up. So as you can see, panes give you a way of organizing your scenes, looking at it from different points of view, whether it be a list view, a scene view, a 3D view, parameters, networks, and there's a whole series of options here. If we right-click, textport, Python, shell, render schedule, etc., etc. So there's a number of options of different pane types available, which you can get from right-clicking on here. You can close any one of these by clicking on these icons here. You can also expand one by going here, by expanding it like this and putting it back. You can also press the hotkey Control B to expand that or to bring that back. Now, if you wanted to look at different views of your scene, you might think, well, I need to set up different panes, a front pane, a side pane, and so on. But actually, the way you look at your 3D view is actually done using viewports. And the viewports are organized through this menu here. For instance, we can show 4 views like this, or we could show 4 views sort of like this. And in this case, your 3D view is broken up into different little pieces like this. Now you can't actually move the lines here, but you can expand. So if you press spacebar B, you can expand that. Spacebar B goes down, or spacebar B to expand that and work with that view. So it just gives you a quick way of moving back and forth between these worlds. Now of course you could certainly take this and create another scene view here with a totally different angle and point of view. But if you want all those views sort of connected and working together, then it's better to keep them in one viewport here and keep this focus on something else like your network view. Anyway, you've got a number of different options. Houdini tries to be as flexible as possible to allow you to set up the kind of desktop that you want. Now once you have a desktop that you like, you can store it in the desktop area here. Here's a number of the default ones that exist. You can save, work with the desktop manager to actually create new desktops and store those away. And you can have that as a customized desktop for you as an individual, or you can, as a studio, set up a series of desktops that you would share with people around the office to have particular setups that you want. So for instance, if I go Windows, Desktop, Animate, you'll see here we have a desktop specifically with two views, a channel list and a channel editor, which we can pop in or pop out as possible, or as needed. And oh sorry, I was going to pop that up to do this. And of course you can also do things like if you wanted to flip this, if you like this on the other side, and you can press, for instance, the tab key to get rid of that. Those two views are very similar. Or you can just say, let's go back to our the build desktop is the default one, the one that we were working with before. Now note that this desktop will not get saved as is by default. You will need to work with the various save and desktop manager and so on to get the desktop that you want saved away. Houdini is best known for its procedural node-based workflow, which continues to be a vital part of the Houdini 9 experience. This lesson is designed for artists who are new to Houdini as an introduction to how our procedural approach can be applied. We will start by prototyping out an idea, then refining it to make it more useful. At the end, we will wrap up the results into a digital asset to make it a tool that others can easily use in their work. Let's get started. We're going to begin by taking a grid object here, bringing it down into the 3D space. We could click anywhere to place it or press the Enter key to put it at the origin. Similarly, we'd like to put a box into space, and if we'd like to go right to the origin, we can actually press the Control key and just click to place that right at the origin, so we don't have to even bring it into the 3D space at all. Once we have that, we'd like to resize it. We could do that by scaling it, but it is a little bit better to do it with the inner options for these are actual box options. So we're going to use its size so that our scale values could stay consistent. Now if we middle click on here, we can actually scale that down, and let's bring that down to 0.5. Now once we have this, we can begin to connect things together. In our node view over here, you can actually see the objects that we're working with. We have a box object and a grid object. Everything we do in Houdini gets placed down as an object node like this. And as we move forward, you'll see other kinds of nodes come into play. Let's go to the Modify menu. We're going to copy the cube onto the grid, press Enter, and now we have a cube at every grid point on the original shape. Now, those two objects we used to have before have now become a single object, and this single object contains nodes for everything we've done so far, placing a box, placing a grid, and the actual copying of the object onto the grid. Now we can go back and play with the history of any of these. We can, for instance, increase the size of the grid up a little bit, or the original box. We can also play with the grid, so we can go in and middle click to make that grid a little bit bigger. We could also reduce the rows and so on, increase the rows, whichever you want. Now once we have this, we would like to have something a little bit more organic. This obviously is a very regular distribution, which doesn't happen very often in nature. So Houdini has a number of other tools that give us more flexibility. Now you'll notice while I'm working with this nodes here is when I have the end node selected, that my focus is on the actual resulting shapes. If I click on the box here, my focus is on the box. If I click on here, my focus is on the grid. Now we're doing this on purpose because by selecting the grid here, we can apply our next tool to it instead of the result. So we're actually going to go and do something not to the result, but to the selected grid. So if we go to Model, and we're going to click Scatter. And what that does is that scatters, well, it looks like 5,000 points all over that grid. Now let's change that to 500, and maybe actually change that to 200. And we've got a number of points nicely distributed over that grid. Now in Houdini, if I want to, I can always specifically display this node, which doesn't look like anything right now, but if you click on points, you'll see as a distribution of points. Or we can click on here as the node we're working on, or the node we want to see, and click on this node to be the node that we're actually working on. So we're actually working, if you go W, well, you can't, the points aren't visible, but we're actually selecting the points. Now we'd like to go one step back again, back to the original grid, and this time we're going to go Deform, and we're going to put a mountain on that. And this mountain actually will go in and start to add some height into there and randomize things in the other direction. So we have some randomization in the other directions. Now we have some randomization along Y. Everything we've done so far still applies. We can still play around with our scatter value, how many surface points are on there. We can still go back to the grid and play around with its size. Now notice as we increase the size of the grid, we're not scaling the boxes, we're scaling their distribution on the grid, but we're not actually scaling the whole system. Now, once I have this, there's a couple other things that I'd like to do. One of them is I'd like to control the scale of these points on the surface. So we're going to click on the mountain node here, and we're going to go Tab and access some functionality which isn't particularly up on the shelf, but we still have access to it. We're going to go Attribute, Create. Now, what this does is it basically just puts an attribute on my nodes, and we're going to call this P-Scale, which is sort of a global parameter, and that global parameter is actually telling the copy node what to do. Because if you click back on the copy node, you'll see transform using template point attributes, and we just put scale attributes on all the points, and those attributes happen to be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So if we go into here and we scale this up, let's say back to 0.5, actually we should go in the positive direction to 0.5, you'll see that we've actually brought that back. Or we could go all the way to 1 and bring them back to their full size. So the values being assigned by this get us started, but we can even go further. If we go into here, let's just take this, I'm going to right click on there, type Paint, and we're going to put a node down in there which is going to allow us to paint attributes in a little more organic way. So we're going to start by scaling down to here and say overriding color, and we're going to go P scale. And you can see we've got a tiny little handle there. Let's change our radius to 1. That's a little bit more appropriate for this. And let's change the value of this to 5. That's my foreground color. My background color, we probably, well, we can keep it at 0 for now. And then opacity, we're going to put 0.01. That'll give us, allow us to do a slow build up. And what we can do is we can come into here and we can start to paint in. And what you see is we're actually painting in the scale for the different areas. So the values that are being assigned on the point, so if we paint on a point over here, are being distributed around onto the surface. And we could actually increase that 10. And then we can sort of really start to build that up and get a more interesting size here. So what you see is we're painting on the sort of grid surface underneath. Even if we go into here the scatter and let's say we increase or decrease this, you'll see that in the areas where we wanted big cubes, we still got big cubes. In the areas where we wanted small cubes, we've got small cubes. So we've got a fair bit control over that here. We can paint a little bit over here, paint a little bit over there. We've got a nice distribution. So we've created a fairly robust system here. Now we'd like to do something a little bit more. Right now all of the cubes that we're working with are all oriented in exactly the same way. So we're going to use something a little more techy, which is an expression, to randomize exactly how that's working. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the box up here. We're going to right click in here and we're going to put in a transform node. And this transform node will give us access to rotation along Y. And we're going to put an expression in here which says stamp. And then we're going to put 3 things in. First is the location of the node that we are working with down here. That's actually the path towards this node here. We're going to put a comma. Then we're going to put an attribute, we'll call it rotate shape. And then we'll put a default value of 0. So if it can't find the information, it will just default to 0. And we go, there we go. We go back to this copy node. We're going to go to stamping, and we're going to turn on stamping, and we're going to go rotate shape. Now what that means is that if I go into here and I rotate this, you see that this node here now controls the rotation of all those objects. Now the thing is that right now they're all being rotated by a single value. So we need to take this and change it to random. And we're going to put basically each point has a sort of unique number. So we're going to do a random number based on a point, and we're going to then multiply that by 360 degrees. So we'll get basically, instead of a value of 0 to 1, we'll get a value of 0 to 360. And we go enter. And what we see now is we get a nice random distribution of rotations for our object in there. So what could have been a very simple system of normal regular objects distributed on a normal regular grid, we now have randomization in rotation, we have randomization in location and position, and we've also have some control over rotation, and through the painting we've actually been able to go in and scale it. Now we could also have painted the rotation in if we wanted, but randomization seemed like a more logical choice in this case. Now the beauty of Houdini is, and this is where the procedural node-based workflow is so exciting, is we can look at this and go, a bunch of rotating cubes. I don't see the point. Well, let's replace that with something else. We're going to go and put a L system in here, which if we zoom in here, you'll see is just almost like a little tree. And we're going to go into here, and we're going to feed the tree into there instead of the other. Oh, let's just go back. Let's change that to primitives, just so we can see the faces. And what we have now is basically, for all intents and purposes, a little forest. The trees have size, they have shape, they have height, and they're all rotated around, so that even though I'm using only one tree shape, I'm actually getting a pretty nice variation in terms of the look and shape of the forest elements. Now, I can also do other things in Houdini which are quite interesting. I can go, for instance, put in what's called a switch. Right click on there, type SW, go down, pull that out, and what I have now is a node for switching, and I can actually switch between the box and the L system. And what that means is I can go boxes, L system, boxes, L system. And what we might want to do is actually switch their order. And the reason we have this is that it allows us to create sort of a low-res, high-res situation for our particular situation here. Now if we wanted these to be a little bit more like trees, we could maybe make that 1 and maybe those 0.3, 0.3. So there we go. They're little representations of what our trees would be like, or if we take the switch node, we can actually switch to the real trees. So that just gives you an example of some of the different variations you can put in your system, things you can do to really control all aspects of it. Now, in addition to being able to build up a system, you may want to share this with other people. And one of the real strengths that Houdini has is the ability to build what's known as a digital asset. And a digital asset is sort of an encapsulation of all of this. So all of this is currently contained inside an object. And what we can do is we can select all of this, and if we want to, press Shift-C to create a single node out of it, which we're going to call forest. Once we have that, let me just pull it up here. Right click there, and we're going to say create digital asset, which is off the screen. But that brings up a window here which allows me to say I want to build a forest, and I go accept. This brings up a pane here, which gives me a lot of options for building up an interface, because as you can see I've got this forest asset here which doesn't really give me much control. So I'm going to come into here and say make me, well, I can make different kinds of attributes myself, or what I can do is I can actually double click into my node here and say, which controls in this system were very important to me. Now, when I bring these, what I can do is go, for instance, that input and drag it over. Now, I want to drag it over with its own name, so I'm going to say don't change the label, and I'm going to drag that over to here. So I get a select input. Then I'm going to look at the grid and say, well, the size of the grid seems to be an important thing to bring over. The height of the mountain was sort of a useful control that somebody might want to work with. The attribute paint and so on, we don't need to do anything with that. We may want to bring over the number of points. And what's neat is when I label them, I can, even though they are points, I can change the name to the number of trees, because we're now looking at more or less a forest asset here. And that gives us all the controls that we could possibly want. We press accept on that, and if we click one level up, you'll see that there's our forest asset with all of these different controls. Next, we can actually take this parameter here and maybe change that into something a little more useful. So we're going to go back into the type properties here. We've got this selected. We're going to set its default value to 0. And then we're going to go to the menu section, say use menu, and we'll enter 0 there and 0 again. In the 0 here, we're going to go boxes. And in this one, we're going to go 1. And click on it again and go trees. We actually don't need that line there. And go accept. And what we get now is we get a menu item that allows us to switch between boxes and trees. So that actually becomes a part of the user interface, and we were able to do that fairly easily using this system. We can also come into here, maybe type in 30, spread that out. Notice how it spreads it out. Actually, let's change that to 60. Really stretch that out. We need probably more points. Let's type 600. Add more trees. They're still respecting the heights that we set up earlier, and this height we could make that a little bit more dramatic there, and sort of have hills and valleys making up that shape. So if we double click into here, you can see the system that goes into building this. And essentially what you've done in a few minutes, we've gone from simply a grid and a cube and built a fairly complex system that we can not only make variations and changes and explorations of, but also encapsulate into a single tool that we can share with other people on our team. So if they need to put down a forest, they just put down a single node and they build the forest of their choice. I hope this has given you a good introduction into how the procedural node-based workflow in Houdini works. And as you go through other lessons in Houdini, you'll find that it's something that you touch upon and you work with a lot. In some cases just for day-to-day work, in some cases for more complex systems that take these kinds of ideas and push them even further. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the new selection modes available in Houdini 9. We're going to learn how to use them to navigate your 3D scene and manipulate different kinds of objects, geometry, particles, etc. Let's start by placing down a simple ground grid. Place this here at the origin. Now up at the object level we have access to the transformation of the object, its placement in 3D space. If we want to use the first selection mode here, click down, we go into geometry mode, which does two things. One is it dives down into the object's geometry level, and it also makes available to us the ability to make selections. In this case, those selections are face selections or primitives. This geometry mode has a number of options, like for instance points, and we can go down and select points as well if we want, as well as edges and vertices. Now once I have that, if I want to press the T key, I can actually start to translate that up. What Houdini does is put down an edit node down here to allow me to get that, and then I can start to manipulate that with a bit of a soft radius there too. Let's get that and pull that up as well. So here we have access to the shape of the object using the geometry selection mode. Now if we want to place new objects, we can certainly go and place a new object into the scene. Place it here, press the Alt key, and place in 3D view. By default that actually creates a new object, takes us back to the object level, and we get a new torus object. And if we wanted to go down to its geometry level, we could press, well, we can actually use hotkeys. 1 is object view, 2 is points, 3 is edges, and 4 is primitives. So let's go 4 for primitives. And we can actually look down there. So notice that as I go down to the geometry level for this object, the other object has actually sort of grayed or ghosted itself out. And this is actually a result of this little menu here, which allows you to either ghost other objects, hide other objects so we don't even know they exist, or you can just show them as if they're normal. But then that makes it harder to figure out why can't I select this object? Well, I'm really focused on this object. And the ghosting really gives you a better clue that this is the object I'm working on, that the object I'm focused on, and the other objects are just there for reference. Now let's go back to the object level for a moment on this. What we'd like to do is take this object, let's move it over, up, and rotate it. And what we'd like to do is put some dynamics on that. So we're going to make that an RBD object. Which by default means that it'll just sort of fall in empty space. But what we'd also like to do is we'd like to add a constraint to this. Now in order to add a constraint to that, we know that it is a dynamic object and we need to select the dynamic object. So we're going to pick the select tool and we're going to go into dynamic selection mode. Now that object which is already selected, we've gone into the dynamics network, and the torus RBD object has been selected, so we're ready to go. So if we now go pin constraint, we can now actually press the Alt key to lift up, and there we go. You've got yourself the pin constraint. So we were able to find the dynamics network for that object simply by selecting it and going into the dynamics mode. Now in this case here, if you see how we're in the what's called auto DOP network. if we go back up to the object level, you'll see that the auto network is actually not inside the torus. It's actually in another network over here. So the new selection mode was actually smart enough to say, well, the RBD object for this torus is actually in that network. So it allows us to jump over there. Another way to do that actually is to, we zoom in here, you can actually right click on this object here and say, take me to the affecting dynamics, and that'll take me to the network there. So you can either do it with the selection mode there, or you can actually just right click on the object and say, go to that world directly for me. Now this is where we can start to mix some of these worlds together. Let's go back to the object level and we'll just start to play that back a little bit. Okay, what we'd like to do is take this object here as we have it. This time we're going to press 4 to go into the geometry selection mode, and we're going to select a bunch of faces off of that object. Now we're going to go to create particles. We're going to source from the particles, and what we get now is that surface is actually spitting out the particles. Now they don't seem to be affected by gravity right now. Now we are in the particle network right here. If we were back at the object level, we'd still see the particles, and if we want to get back to that network, we would basically go to the particle mode there, which is 6, and that would dive down. Because they were already selected, it would dive down into that network. From there we can drive the particles using gravity. Notice that already kicks in, you get a feeling for that. So the particles are now falling. And we can also do something like, let's say, collision. So we're going to pick this surface and enter. Now they sort of bounce all over the place. So what we're going to do is we're just going to tone that down a little bit by saying stick on collision. And now these particles come in and they stick on the surface that we are colliding with. And they are still visible if we press 1 and go to the object level, go to the object selection mode. These are still available. You can still see the particles and how they work. As a matter of fact, when we applied the particles to this object here, they didn't get put directly into the torus object. Again, like the dynamics, they were pulled out into a separate object, and that separate object, it grabs the geometry of the torus in and then does the particles from there, and it keeps the particles in world space where they're going to react better to dynamic forces and so on, and are not affected by any other transformations that might be on the torus. Now we can continue to work this way. For, let's say we want to bring a second torus in, so we bring this in, press the Alt key, lift up. Let's go in and quickly make that a rigid body object. Oops, because we're at frame 121 it disappeared, but don't worry, if we go back to frame 1 everything will be fine. We can also take the select tool, click on this surface here, and we'll make that a terrain object, so it'll actually be a nice thin object that everything just sort of collides with. And we'd like to make one further connection, sort of interconnection between them all, is we'd like to take, well, let's get those particles. So again, we go to particle mode and double click on those. So now we're in the particle network for there. Oh, just make sure we're in there. Once we're in there, we can say drive particles, collision, and we want to pick this object as a second colliding object, and this time we want the behavior to be bounce. We just go back to here and play, and you see now we're getting a little bit of bouncing off of those objects when the particles hit that object, even though they stick when they hit that object, and this carries through obviously when you're at the object level as well. Okay, so what we've been able to see in this lesson so far is that we have several different selection modes within Houdini. These selection modes give you access to objects, geometry, particles, and dynamics. For instance, you can go dynamics, click on this object here, actually select the modifier right there. Actually, we've got to pick modifiers there, which will allow us to grab that modifier. If we wanted the handle tool, we could actually remanipulate where that is in space. We can also pick particles, using this mode here, and we have hotkeys for all of them. Basically 1 for objects, 2 for points, 3 for edges, 4 for faces, 5 for vertices, 6 goes to particles. Make that selection if we want, press 6, and 7 for dynamics, which sometimes it might be better to go to the object level, select the object you want to explore the dynamics for, and press 7 to get down there. These selection modes essentially allow us to navigate around our scene and get the networks that we want to, because both this parameter pane and this network follow whatever your selection is in here. Being able to select exactly what you want in 3D view and have your network update to take you to that place makes these very strong network navigation tools, as well as a nice WYSIWYG interactive tool for working in the viewport. Keeps your focus on your objects in 3D as opposed to on network nodes and other things that maybe you don't have this as direct an association with as you're working artistically through your scene. In conclusion, it is recommended that you take some time to learn how the different selection modes work, because they will play an important role in working with Houdini 9. It's also be aware that if you click and hold on these, you have access to options as well as the selection of the types themselves. And if you want to right click on here, you can actually change options on here without ever selecting it. So if you right click on, you've changed the options without selecting it. If you left click on here, then you will actually make the selection at the same time that you're making the modification to the menu item. So a couple different approaches there, and hope you enjoy working with the new selection modes. Welcome to Houdini 9. I'm very excited to introduce you to the new user interface that has been redesigned to make Houdini more accessible to a wider group of users. Houdini 9 is much easier to learn because it now works with more typical UI standards. Let's take a quick tour around the new UI while working through a simple project. One of the main elements that's new to Houdini 9 is the tool shelf that we have up at the top here. It's actually split up into 2 zones, each zone containing its own set of tools, which you can organize through menus like this menu here and also this menu here. Now let's start with putting down a tool. Let's take this grid object right here. We click on the tool here. We bring that into the 3D view. When we do, we can navigate around to place, or we can press the Alt key to lift it up away from the grid, place it somewhere up in space, or simply press the Enter key to place it at the origin. Once we have an object down like this, we can do a number of things. We can translate, rotate, scale it, which will change the parameters here at the object level, otherwise known as the scene level of the object. Or we can take a look at some of these parameters up here, like for instance the size. And if we middle mouse button on here, we can get a parameter ladder, which allows us to resize that here. And in this case here, I'm actually changing the size of the object of the object's geometry node and not changing the scale here. Now, if I want to take a look at that node, the node that actually creates the grid object there, I can actually click this little button here to dive down, and you'll see here I am down at a new level known as the geometry level, and I now am actually working with the grid object down below. As you work through Houdini, you'll get used to working with the different levels and hierarchies within Houdini, but this just gives you a quick introduction to a couple of these levels. If I click back up here, we'll go up to this level here. Another way of getting in there is actually if I go to the object itself here in the network editor, I can actually double click on that and go inside and find it. So there's a couple different ways of navigating up and down and around, and you'll learn a few of those as we proceed. Let's click again on here to bump us back up to that object level, and click an empty space to deselect. Now we'd like to put another object down. This time let's put some text down. So again we'll use the shelf, but this time rather than clicking and working interactively, if we want to go to the origin right away, we can actually press the Control key and click right on the font tool. And a lot of our generators work that way. Some of our other tools use the Control click as well, but we'll explore that a little bit later. Now we can't see that quite yet. What we'll do is we'll fix that in a second. We're going to actually type in the text Houdini 9. So a number of the things that I might want to do with this text I can actually change here. Let's change its font type, and maybe its size we can go to 2. Now the thing is, when I look at this, I can either raise it up by, again, moving up and down, but if I dive down into it and work with the font node, I'll find that there's actually a parameter in here that says center vertically is the default, and I don't really want to do that. I'd prefer it to be on the ground. So I can use some of the parameters here so that I can go back to the object level, and I haven't changed any of these parameters yet. I'll save those later for animation. So you have a couple different ways of working, which the different levels let you do. So we've used the shelf, which allows us to create tools. You notice that it's allowed us to create objects, and inside those objects are geometry nodes that create the shapes, in this case either the text or the grid. We've also used sort of this path here to navigate up and down and have a sense of where we're going, and we've shown you a little bit about the network editor. We'll go into more detail on that later. Now I'd like to extrude this text, and in order to extrude it I'm going to take advantage of the new selection types that we have here. Now this is the object selection type. That's the first one. The second one is geometry, and there's, if you right click on here, or actually left click and hold, there are a number of options here, and we're going to stick with the primitive one. And this does two things. One is it navigates us down to the object, just like the other methods did, but this one specifically focuses on our ability to select faces, so we can go in and select faces on this object. Now you notice I can't select faces off this other object here. I can only do it here. Although if I do double click on that object, I can go in and select faces here instead. So it just we only work one object at a time, because you'll see how I'm now in the grid object. If I double click on the text, now it doesn't work if you do it here, but if you double click where it's uniquely on the text, you'll see now my path is the font object, and now I can select and work with that. So I've got a sort of interactive way of navigating up and down and around into my different objects. So I can select all of this text if I want, and we can extrude that. Let's go to the polygon tool shelf here, and let's extrude those faces out. We're going to pull them out here. Now that we have this, I'd like to just show you some of the viewing tools that we can work with. When you're working in Houdini, you can either go into the view tool here just by pressing escape, but that will take you there permanently. Usually while you're working you want to temporarily go into the view state. So what we do is we press the space bar, which takes you into view temporarily, and then you can left click to tumble, middle click to pan, and right click to dolly in and out. You can also use, if you have a scroll mouse button, you can use the scroll mouse button to zoom, but those are just some of your options. Now I'm going to tumble around with the left key, just to notice that at the back I don't have faces in there, so I can go to the options tab under poly extrude and say output back, and I've now got faces all the way around the object. Now you notice I am down at the geometry level, so I'm literally working with the shape of the object. Many of the modeling tools will do that. Often you'll start at the object level, but then you get down to the geometry level where you will manipulate and work with things. So I can continue to pull this out or push it back or get that to correct. I can also continue working from here. I can select all of the faces, both front and back. Let's tumble around. We got front and back. And we're going to just click over here a little bit, and we'll click on the facet tool. And the facet tool will actually allow us to, it does a lot of cleanup on your geometry, but the one that we're looking for right now is actually cusp polygons. We're going to set the angle to 85, and that will just give us a nice clean, if we click an empty space, gives us a nice sort of smooth edges here and nice clean edges at the front. And if we press the H key in here, we can see the 3 nodes that are currently comprised of that, making that 3D text. I'd like to take you, we've seen the 2 different selection types here. These have hotkeys associated with them. For instance, I can press 1 to go back to the object level. I can press 2 to start manipulating points on the surface. 3 gets me edges. 4 gets me faces, like we were just working with. And then the other ones we'll get to later, but 1 will take me back to the object level. So that just that's how you begin to use these selection types here. The next thing I'd like to do is set up a couple. Well, it's hard to see these things because of the colors. We could obviously work with our shaded view here and say go into wireframe mode. Oh, that's a bounding box. So we'll go to wireframe here. Maybe a hidden line. That gives us, well, not a lot more clarity. We can go flat shaded. We can do various things in here. The other thing, of course, would be to add some materials onto this and begin to give it some color. So we're going to go to the new material palette in Houdini 9. This is everything that you work with in here are called panes. So we have a pane zone here, we have a pane zone here, and we have a pane here. And each of these individual little pieces here are called pane tabs. And that allows us to have, for instance, a network view and a material palette within the same zone, and just go back and forth between them as need be. This allows us to have a lot more flexibility in our layout and a little more versatility as we work. So I'm going to drag a material over to here. We're going to change its color to, let's say, a blue, sort of a dark, sort of saturated sort of blue there. We can just click there to update the icon for it. And then we're going to drag that onto this there and onto the text. Now, the reason I'm putting it onto both is because you can actually share materials, a material like this, with multiple objects and still have some uniqueness between them. So let's take a look at that. When I click on an object like this, you'll see that there's where the material gets assigned onto the material tab for that object. And if I want to, I can say create local parameters for that particular surface. So I can say, oh, give me a Lambert for the ground, and maybe change the roughness a little bit. Actually, that won't. We won't have a lot of specular color in there, so we'll just leave that there. And what we can do is we can say, well, we'll come back to that in a second. Similarly, we can take the text, go to the material tab, and say create local materials for that. And I'm going to click on here, and we're going to make that orange. In this case here, maybe change our specular color, make that a little darker. So what we've basically done is both these objects share the same material here, but they have local parameters that modify the material a little bit. So it's much more efficient because rather than having one shader for every look that we want to have in Houdini, we can actually have one shader or material assigned and have local parameters. So if I take this and say remove unchanged parameters, you'll see that the material that I have assigned on here is this one with these two changes. Similarly, I have this one, which is basically this material with these two things changed. And you get the sort of a sense of how you can begin to distribute your materials around your scene. You could have different texture maps on many objects, but all share the same base shader, and therefore it's easier to propagate the shaders. You can work with fewer shaders as you go along and just work with those local parameters. That's another area of enhancement within Houdini 9, which we can go into more detail in another video, but I just want to give you a sense of that. So we've got this. Now we'd like to set up, let's say, a light and a camera. So let's get a nice view going here. We may want to click on the grid. Notice that when we select with the select tool, we're not getting the nice information that we were getting up in here for what's going on under the surface. That only occurs when you're in what's called the handle tool, which is over here, and you press the enter key to get back into that. So therefore, if we wanted to increase the size of that ground grid, we can do that there. If we use translate, rotate, and so on, you don't get that. So you want to be in the handle tool if you want that information there, and the select tool just gives you a quick way of making the selections and so on. Although you can make those selections when you're in other tools, but sometimes you just want to focus on selection if you want to. So anyways, we made that ground grid, we got the angle, space bar, got this set up. Now there's two different ways we could put a camera into the scene and try to line it up with the view, or we can simply say new camera from there. We get a new camera looking from the same angle we were just looking. And we could also get that by pressing the control key and clicking on the camera there. To set up a light, we can just tumble around here, get down from this angle here, press the control key and click on the spotlight option here. We can then go to the light parameters for that, scroll down, maybe change this to 22, change the cone delta to 3, tighten that up a little bit. We can then tumble around here. Now notice when we tumble around, even though we were looking through the light, as soon as we start tumbling, we lose that connection between what we were looking through our current view, but we'll learn how to lock that down in a second. Go over to here, I can press the control key and put down a point light. Now that's quite strong, so what I'll probably do is go into here and change the light intensity to 0.25, so it works as a secondary light. So we've got one light up here, one light down here, and a camera over here. Let's look through the camera again by picking off this menu and zooming in there. And we've got our light set up. We'd like to do a quick rendering, test how that's looking. Go Render, Create Render Node. Mantra is the internal render in Houdini and the one we're going to use. And we're going to just kick a quick rendering off to see how that looks. Perfect. Now, we may want some more things going on, like for instance we may decide, oh, it'd be really nice to have shadows going from the light. So we can click on the spotlight here, turn on shadows, and just say ray trace shadows with, we don't need transparency, and go render and start another rendering just from there. And that will kick up into here as well. It's a slight change because we now have the shadows. So there we've set up a simple rendering, which is sort of a nice start, and looked a little bit at the new user interface. I'd like to show you a couple other things. We talked about if I want to stay in this view and change the angle, I can lock this down, and then as I tumble around and use my view tools, I'm actually updating the position of the camera. If I unclick that though, I'm actually kicked out totally and allows me to do other kinds of things. So you've got those options. Now also, once I've set the lighting up, and I'm probably not going to fiddle with it, it may be a little moody for my day-to-day work. So I can also turn on the headlight option here, which just cleans things up lighting wise and lets me focus on my work. I can always, when I render, the lights will still be applied, but it gives me an option there. I can also turn off the grid if I find that that's just not necessary for what I'm doing anymore. I can select the text. Let's actually raise that up. We're going to raise that up a little bit and rotate. Now these tools here are actually controlled by hotkeys. You've got T for translate, rotate for R for rotate. You can do scale for E, although at the object level probably don't want to scale that much. It's better to do that down at the geometry level. And you can press enter to get the handle tool, which gives you access to both those things and also gives you access to some information up here, like for instance from the facet node that's underneath. Now talking about the nodes, let's take a look at the network. The network is such an important part of Houdini where a lot of the power exists. Press the H key to home in on that, and let's double click into the font object and press H again to home into that. So we've got three things going. We've got the font, we've got the extrude, and we've got the facet. Now I'd like to do a little bit more with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the facet down, and we're going to actually insert some nodes in here. These are a little more technical nodes. There are ways of doing it in this view as well, but since we're going to apply it to everything, it's just as efficient to do it here. Notice that as I go to the connectors here, I'm getting feedback as to where the connectors are. I find that connector, I right click, and I know the node that I'm looking for is connectivity. So CONN finds the tool, I press enter, and I place that down. Now what this does is this will actually take the different letters that I'm working with and break them down based on their connection to each other. So we're going to call them letter shapes is the name of the attribute that I'm going to produce using the connectivity node. Well, then we're going to right click again. This time we're going to get partition. Press the arrow key down to get that. Click down, and this node we're going to create a rule called letters, and we're going to go $letter shapes. And what this essentially does is say create one group for every letter shape attribute that we've found, which is based on connectivity. So if I middle click on here rather, you'll see that I have 10 primitive groups called letters 0, letters 1, letters 2. And those are essentially these connected H, connected O, connected U, connected D. And we're doing this because of what we want to do next. The next step being that we want to actually do a dynamic simulation of the text falling. But rather than it falling as one big group, we need these individual groups so that it actually falls and breaks up. So we're going to go back to the object level, take this, put that up a little bit, rotate it a little bit. We're going to go to another shelf item here. We're going to go to rigid bodies, and we're going to go RBD fractured object. That'll put some gravity on, that'll get the object ready for simulation. We're going to put a ground plane to give an infinite ground plane for essentially for collision. We're going to turn that off, we don't need to see that. Click here, go back here, press play, and there we go. We have our object actually clicking and reacting like that. If we don't like exactly how that's turning out, we can take that, press, let's say, R to rotate, tumble that around, and press play. Get a different reaction there. So there we are. We've done a nice little exploration of the user interface. We've looked at the shelf and how we can place tools into our 3D view using the shelf. We've talked about different selection modes for things like if we want to pick geometry to do things like polyextrude, also to navigate up and down from the scene view to the geometry view. We've navigated nodes by double-clicking here to go in and fiddle with the networks inside. We've connected network nodes together, inserted nodes in between. We worked with the parameter pane over here, which is basically tied to your selection. If I select something here, I get that updating there. If I select something here, I get that update. We've also worked with our pane tabs. You know, we have different pane tabs here that are connected to the different views that we're in. And we've also taken a look at some of the viewing options, such as looking through a camera, which will make more sense once we do that, and also setting up lights, even going so far as to look through a light or set up a light for rendering. And if we wanted to set this up as a rendering, we would have to say Edit Render Node, bring that up, in which case we would say Render Frame Range, and maybe we only have to go about 100 frames, and we would then press Render, and we would have a animated sequence of the whole piece. So once the rendering of the frames is complete, we can play back and see the finished animation. It comes complete with all the geometry, dynamics, lights, cameras, and materials that we have set up. I hope this has given you a good introduction into what Houdini 9 has to offer. Obviously, there's a lot of power and depth in Houdini that we haven't just begun to scratch the surface on. The most important thing is that you've seen that the Houdini 9, the user experience is much friendlier and will offer a wider range of users access to the power that Houdini is well known for. So hope you have time to work with more of our tutorials as we get deeper and deeper into the software, and enjoy using Houdini as much as we do. Thanks. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the viewing and display options available in Houdini 9. Let's place a simple object down into the scene, which we can there see it in 3 dimensions. From here, we can use our default view tools. Let's press the space bar to kick into view mode, and then we can left click to tumble, middle click to pan around, and right click to zoom in. We can also use the scroll key to zoom in as well. Once we've got that, we can begin to look and explore different options around that object. Now, if at any time we want to get back to sort of the home view we were in before, we can go spacebar H, will take us to a home view centered around this grid. If we put, let's say, another object in, let's put a box over here, pressing spacebar A will actually center us around all of our objects and focus on all of the objects, and spacebar G will focus us on the selected object. So H takes us to a home centered around the grid, of which on this menu here you'll see that you can actually change the size of the grid. So if you had a bigger grid, that you'd have a bigger home. If you have a smaller grid, you have a smaller home. Spacebar A gives you all your objects, and spacebar G gives you the focus on this object here, which you can then begin to work around like this, or spacebar H, and focus on the whole thing. In addition to those sort of basic viewing tools, you can actually get access to a lot of hotkeys on that by clicking on here and go home. There's some of your hotkeys as well, some of your options to do with going home. You can also frame the view which basically means that if I'm down at this angle, I can go spacebar F, and it frames the grid, and spacebar Shift F will focus on the selection. Spacebar FG or spacebar FA will frame. It keeps the angle of view that you're working with, but then just frames all of the objects. So those are some of the other viewing options that you have available there. You can set your view in here to either perspective, top, front, etc. Now these also require the spacebar, so spacebar 2, spacebar 3, spacebar 4, spacebar 1 to go back to 3D. If you want to see more than one view at a time, you've got this menu here which gives you a number of options. You can go to a 4-view system here. You can also go to, let's say, a 3-view where you've got 2 views here and 1 view here. Spacebar H, spacebar H, spacebar H. And then you get sort of your focus on the objects, and then you can work from there. At any point you can go to spacebar B to bring that one forward. Spacebar B again will push that back. Spacebar B will bring that forward. Spacebar B will push that back. So that allows you to work back and forth between different views. You can also, if you want this whole pane to get bigger and actually get rid of so you can't see these, you can go Control B, and that will take your whole pane up to a larger level, whereas spacebar B will make that one bigger, and Control B will take that back to where it was. So it minimizes and maximizes the pane, and that gives you a good start of some of those options. You also have some display options for the objects themselves. This menu here lets you work with bounding boxes, wireframe, flat shaded. Once you pick a particular shaded mode like smooth wire, where you can actually see the wires as well, you can actually have the W hotkey to just toggle back and forth between wireframes. So that just takes whatever your current shaded mode is and toggles back and forth between them. So that gives you a nice option there. Now along the way, I did show you how all of these hotkeys, you press the space bar and you do all the various tumbling and so on that you work with, and that evokes, the space bar evokes the view tool. If you actually press the escape key at any point, you are actually in the view tool, totally dedicated to the view tool. In this case, you can actually, you don't need the space bar, you can actually left click, middle, etc. And hotkeys like 1, 2, 3, 4 will actually function here without you having to press the space bar. But since most of the time you're in the middle of an action, like let's say moving this object, you're working away and you go, ooh, I want to focus on all the objects, press space bar A, get you in there, let you focus on the objects, or space bar H, get you to the home view. So those are just some of the options available for viewing within Houdini. You also have some display options here on the side, which allow you to see the points on your objects. You can see point numbers, a number of other interesting possibilities here for displaying your objects. For a much more sophisticated list, just press the D key in here and you'll get access to a whole series of display options for the viewport, for the setup, and how this viewport can look. Even things like just do I see the icon for the XYZ. Well, hopefully that'll get you started with viewing in Houdini. Remember, the spacebar is your most regular tool for doing viewing actions, and that you do have access to a number of hotkeys which are available through here, and you can set views using this here, or just simply press spacebar B to toggle back and forth between multiple views in this way, in which case you don't need to worry about that. Another way of looking at your views, if we go spacebar B, is through cameras. These views are not by default actually a camera. They're not a physical camera. You notice there are no cameras in the scene. If we want a camera, what we can do is click on the camera tool, place a camera in the scene. It's sort of pointed this way right now. We can use the handles to sort of point it that way, maybe point it up a little bit, or actually maybe push that up a bit. Now once we've got that, we want to look through it, so we click on the camera menu here and we say let's look through the camera. By default we get some handles, which actually now as long as the camera is selected and I'm looking through it, I'll get some handles to manipulate some of its parameters, tilt and so on. But if I tried to use any of my viewing tools like spacebar tumble, I'll be kicked out of there. Now you can also
select the camera, and if you lock your camera to your view, then I can actually use my spacebar, rotate, scale, zoom, etc. to help me position the camera, and I'm actually changing where the camera is in 3D space. So that's a nice connection between your viewing tools and your camera. But if you want to protect that so you don't actually accidentally change your camera while viewing, you can just unclick that there and move forward. Also, if I'm, let's say, at another point here and I like that angle and I don't have a camera yet, one of the options is simply to select new camera from there, and I'll get a second camera from that point of view. So I'll have camera 1 and camera 2 set up like this. If you set up a light, let's tumble around and set up a spotlight. Oh, now we can set up a spotlight by going like this, putting it up in space, rotating it around, going down. We can actually go camera, look through light, and then from there again we can lock it and just use that as a means of changing how the light is going to illuminate that object. Similarly, if this wasn't locked, we could move around in space, and if we wanted to, we're over here, we can press the control key and actually click on, let's say, that point light, and we'll get a light directly looking that way. We want to change its intensity a little lower. But setting up lights and cameras and then being able to lock the view to really modify where you want things to go is a good use of the viewing tools to help you position and organize your lights and cameras. We unlock that if we want to then really look at our scene up here, or we can look through here to see how that lighting is affecting our camera. Well, I hope this lesson has given you a good introduction to some of the viewing display options within Houdini, as well as how to set up some cameras and lights and view through those as well. And you'll probably see some of these tools in action as we go through future tutorials down the line. Thanks.